Hello everybody, it's Father Peter Anthony here from St Benet's, Kentish Town. I was wondering if we could have a think in this video this week about virtual celebrations of the Eucharist. There's been an explosion of comment and thought and reflection over the past few weeks in social media and in all sorts of other websites and different places, all about how we should celebrate the Eucharist. It's been a real kind of springtime of sacramental theology. It's been very, very interesting indeed. So I thought it might be profitable and worthwhile just to think a bit more specifically about that whole question of whether a virtual celebration of the Eucharist is any good or not. When I say that, I mean it's the idea that someone presiding at the Eucharist, a priest, might place bread and wine on the table in front of, say, a computer, and preside over the Eucharist having gathered the congregation via Zoom or through live streaming, and that each person in their individual home might put bread and wine in front of the television or the computer, however they're watching the broadcast, and that the consecration of the elements in front of the priest's computer would extend to bread and wine that all those other people might have prepared and laid in front of the computer screen, and that when they receive that bread and wine they might consider that that's a valid celebration of the Eucharist and that they are receiving the body and blood of Christ, as if they'd been gathered in a church somewhere and that the same priest had presided using almost exactly the same liturgy but just physically present. I want to argue quite categorically there's some really big problems in this idea of virtual celebration. I think the answer is we're in a pickle at the minute. We are in lockdown. But one of the answers that we're called to make our way to, I think, is that it's a matter of waiting until we can physically gather, because I think there's a physical character to the sacraments that's really crucial. If we suddenly get rid of that, I think that's to our peril. So I just want to think about two or three further questions at the heart of virtual celebrations that make it a difficult thing to espouse, I think. 4 reasons, and I want to point you to some really excellent writing and thinking that's been going on in the past week that you can go away and have a look at. The first thing, I think, now I'm going to say a terrible, wicked thing. You may all recoil in horror when I say this, I don't know. So just clutch your pearls now to prepare yourself. I'm going to say a controversial thing that some people are going to get very upset by. I don't think a virtual gathering of people is a real human gathering of people. There, I've said it. I have told the Emperor that he is naked. I know lots of people in this world of ours would like to tell you that a virtual gathering of people is just as good as meeting with someone in the same room. I'm afraid it just isn't. There is a physicality to our existence created by God that exists in time and space. And for as wonderful and as useful as virtual meetings might be, particularly at the minute whilst we're all in this pickle of lockdown, for as wonderful as they might be, it's not the same as meeting physically with someone in the same room. A meeting where you can see and touch and sense someone in a whole number of different ways. Where you can read their body language as well as their words. You might be able to smell them, perhaps. I don't know, it could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the scenario. All sorts of things that you read out of a physical meeting. A virtual meeting via Zoom or through live streaming is a good thing, but it's not a physical gathering. And that's the big problem at the heart of using that as a means to celebrate the Eucharist. There's a really excellent article appeared in the past few days by someone called Charlie Bell. It's called The Eucharistic Feast, Participation, Representation and Sacramental Integrity in the Time of Social Distancing. And it's quite a dense and really meaty and excellent article. But he tackles this question about what the sacraments are and how we can celebrate them in this time of social distancing. One of the key truths at the heart of what he points to is that there's a physicality both about the incarnation, about the church and about the sacraments, and really those three things and their physicality and their rootedness in time and space is actually part of the same mystery. There's something physical about the way in which Jesus became man in one place at one time in one culture. There's something physical about bread and wine. that through that temporal physicality communicates the divine presence. There's something physical about the church found in all places and at different times and in different cultures. He's got some really great one-liners. Well, this is a two-sentence, 1, 2, 3. There's a 5-liner, this one coming up, but this is a very good line. He says this: the incarnational nature of Christianity thus becomes clear. There is a physicality and a temporality to the institution of the sacraments which fundamentally defines their underlying nature. Sacramental theology cannot be newly formed to meet each different situation. There's something deeper and metaphysical that is required for the sacraments to perform their role in salvation. Really excellent stuff. He points to all sorts of different things that goes to the heart of the physicality of the sacraments, the stuff of which they're made, the matter, real bread and real wine. The fact that touch is important in our understanding of Eucharistic consecration. And if touch is suddenly thrown out of the window as necessary in this sacrament, what about the sacrament of baptism? Can that be done virtually without any water? I don't think anybody's arguing for that. So he points out that all sorts of logics that aren't used in other scenarios are just suddenly being applied to our celebration of the Eucharist at this point. He's got a very good way of describing the character of virtual gathering, and he puts it this way. He really puts his finger on it, or gives us a way of describing what it is that's both good and not quite fulfilling what it could be. Those participating in the Eucharist are therefore performing a corporate but not gathered fellowship. That's when it takes place virtually. So there is a corporate character to gathering virtually, but it's not the gathered, the physically gathered character that we see has always characterised the celebration of the Eucharist. It also risks lapsing into a sort of hocus pocus magic understanding of the Eucharist by insisting that a Zoom celebration is legitimate. Charlie says this: the risk of seeing the consecration as an incantation rather than incarnate reality becomes heightened when the physicality of one bread is removed. So I'd really urge you to have a look at that article. And it really goes to the heart of the first point I want to make, that there's a physicality to the sacraments, and there's a physicality to the gathering of the church. For as wonderful and as useful as virtual gathering might be, it's not the real thing. The only thing I'd say about this article is he quotes someone who's all in favour of jiggling everything up and doing it in virtual ways, who is called Jonathan Baker. But I'm assuming that is not the same Jonathan Baker who is Bishop of Fulham. I can't speak for what Bishop of Fulham thinks, but I very much doubt that he is in favour of all the things that the Jonathan Baker in this article espouses. So as you read it, just be aware of the fact there is more than one Jonathan Baker in this little world of ours. Point number 2. I've been thinking about live streaming and live broadcasts, and I think point number 2 is this. I don't think there's any such thing as live streaming or live broadcasting. One of the things everyone's saying at the minute is, oh, now we've got Zoom, we can all celebrate the Eucharist by Zoom. Isn't it wonderful? I think we've always had the capacity for the past 70 years or so. In any world that has telephone, radio or television, we have the capacity to broadcast the sound of someone's voice and the image of them speaking to a distant place that's in a completely different location. But when you think about it, lots of people say, well, recording is okay, but live is better. And when you're live streaming, it's as if you're there in the very room because the communication is immediate. You're hearing it as if you were actually there. I don't think that's actually the case, because if you think about it, any recording of the human voice or any recording of human image, which is then broadcast and sent to another place by electronic means, is automatically, by its very nature, in the past. The time lag might be infinitesimal, it might be absolutely tiny, but nonetheless, what you're seeing on the screen took place a tiny portion of a second ago. There is no such thing as live broadcasting. Now, you might argue, even when you meet someone physically, that it takes time for sound waves to move from someone's mouth to your ears or whatever. But there's certainly something about live streaming which is just quite simply not the same as when you gather in the same room as someone. I think all of it is recorded sound and images from the past. And the intriguing thing is that most people admit that somehow there's something second best about a recording of a sacramental action. The weird thing is, we've had live broadcasting of liturgies for 70 years. We've all seen it on the television. So, choral matins from Canterbury Cathedral for Easter morning, or choral Eucharist from Westminster Abbey for midnight mass. We've had these for years, and the near universal consensus of every Christian tradition has been they're a nice thing, but by watching them, you're not actually participating in the sacramental action taking place there. And were you to put bread and wine in front of your telly, it wouldn't be consecrated. So it's odd that suddenly, in the past 3 to 4 weeks, almost exactly the same process, but just done by Zoom or live streaming, is suddenly being asserted as a real participation in the sacrament being celebrated. So we really need to think about the fact, I think, that there is no such thing as live broadcasting or live streaming. All of it, even though it be to an infinitesimal degree, is a recording from the past using electronic means to broadcast that sound and those images to another place and another person. So what, if we've had this for 70 years and there's been this near universal consensus that it isn't a way to celebrate the sacraments, what's changed? I think the culture in which it exists is what's changed. We live now in a postmodern consumerist society. What is the one thing that someone who lives in a postmodern consumerist society fears and which would send them over the edge in the most terrible way? The one thing that someone in that kind of society can't cope with is not getting what they want when they want it. We're all a bit like that. I'm like that myself. We live in a society where we think we have certain rights to expect certain things. If we have money, we have even more pronounced sense of entitlement to certain things. And we live in a world in which the consumer is king. If an Amazon delivery is 3 days late, we have a nervous breakdown. I paid for that and it said it would come yesterday. Why is it not here? I do it as much as anyone else. I'm not claiming to be I'm not standing external to this culture. So the thing that's changed, I think, is not our capacity to live stream, which has existed for a long time. It's the culture in which we live. And I think what people are not coping with at the minute is not getting what they want when they want it. If you were to speak to some of the greatest martyrs of the church about the fact that we have not been able to celebrate the Eucharist for 1 month, they would laugh us out of the room. They would laugh us out of the room. We postmodern snowflakes, the wonderful people of, the people that lived through 70 years of atheist Soviet communism, the great martyrs of the persecutions of the early church, all these wonderful stories about people who went for months and years without being able to celebrate the Eucharist together. They would guffaw at us that we're getting in this knicker twist over not being able to celebrate the Eucharist for a few months. So I think the real thing that's revealed is not that we have a new capacity to live stream, it's that our culture has changed. And I think the people that are advocating most strongly the need for virtual celebrations, I think are most rooted in this consumerist postmodern culture in which we have a right to expect whatever we want whenever we want it. And then we have a real kind of breakdown moment when we don't get what we want in a way that we feel we have an entitlement to. Point number 3. I think virtual celebrations of the Eucharist are inherently and fundamentally exclusive. Let me explain what I mean. There's a great article in this week's Church Times by Alice Wally, who has pointed out lots of really interesting things. The main point that she makes is going on about virtual worship is all great for middle class people that are media and information technology savvy. She works in a very different parish where a lot of the people are more vulnerable and in lower social strata and with less financial income. She spent most of her time during this crisis manning food banks, keeping in touch with those who are feeling isolated, helping out those in trouble. She put out a YouTube video of worship on Sunday and noticed only 6 people bothered to watch it. She pointed out that there is a sort of internet poverty in our world where the less advantaged and more vulnerable parts of our society don't have access to the internet in the same way that middle class graduates simply take for granted. The moment you erect a virtual celebration of the Eucharist, you are drawing boundaries around who may come because you have to invite a set number of people. It's not the same as a physical celebration of the Eucharist in a church where the doors are open. And even though you might be having a celebration of the Eucharist, a Mass for a particular group of people, it's still a public act of worship to which anybody is welcome to come. I think that's the great danger in these celebrations of the Eucharist virtually. I think we're recreating all those dramas from 1 Corinthians 11 where those who are wealthy have the capacity to control who is included and who is not. Read Alice Wally's article, it's really excellent, and it points to some really shocking realities at the heart of a number of assumptions that we all make about how everybody's just universally connected to the internet. They're not. Large numbers of people find that they don't have the access to the internet and to virtual ways of doing things that the moneyed middle classes do. Point 4. I think that presidency over the Eucharist also involves a certain sense of being a custodian or guardian of the sacraments. Now, I don't think this is the first lens through which one ought to start thinking about the Eucharist. But when you're ordained a priest, one of the things you are called to do is to ensure that the sacraments are celebrated appropriately and that those who should be receiving them receive them, and that on the odd occasion where those who shouldn't be receiving them or haven't prepared appropriately, they shouldn't receive them. We're all supposed to be on the lookout, aren't we, when we administer the sacrament on a Sunday morning? Someone's spiriting away a host to do all sorts of diabolical, terrible things to. And with the sacraments of initiation, a parish priest will always make sure that baptism candidates or confirmation candidates are well prepared. Well, it strikes me that it's almost impossible to exercise that custodianship or guardianship over the sacraments in a virtual celebration. First of all, the priest has no idea what people are putting in front of their computers at the other end. Rivitas, oat cakes, all sorts of strange things. You can't actually see what you're being asked to consecrate. No, so you don't actually know what's on the other end of the celebration. You don't know what happens to that afterwards. Within the Anglican tradition, there are some very, very clear expectations about what happens to the elements at the end of a Eucharistic celebration. Anything left over is either appropriately reserved or is consumed. And the celebrant has no idea about what is going on. People can give all sorts of assurances, but it can't be tested or seen. You can't see what's happening off camera. So the idea that somehow it's the same as being in the same room with someone, it's just not the case. So I think there is an appropriate sense in which a priest is a custodian and guardian of the sacraments to make sure that they are not abused or neglected, or that anything inappropriate happens. For, as Christians, we believe that the Blessed Sacrament is one of the most precious things in existence, the very presence of Christ with us. Why would we want to endanger that? So there's some further reading for you all to think about. I think broadly speaking, I'm less than convinced that virtual Eucharists are a good idea. I can see why people want them. I can see that people desperately yearn for the Eucharist. That is a good thing. That is a really excellent thing. I just don't think, as Charlie Bell points out, I just don't think the present circumstances warrant such an amazing change to the physical way in which we celebrate the sacraments, which has been handed down to us through the ages. Rather, I think it's about yearning for that day, which will not be long, yearning for that day that will not be long, when we can celebrate the sacraments together as a gathered community. So those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear back from scientists on whether there is such a thing as live broadcasting, whether I'm just talking out the back of my head. Have a read of some of these really interesting articles that have emerged over the past few days. And hopefully that's been of some use as you work out what you think, and as we continue to discuss all these matters in these very changing and at times quite confusing times. Thanks very much.